Hello everybody. It's so nice that you were able to join us today. We have a very special guest, an artist that has been producing work for at least 42 years, has been a university professor for at least 30 years. So this is Bryan Ryley. And Bryan, we're going to ask some questions about the exhibition that opened on March the 12th. Unfortunately, hasn't been seen that much, but this is a great opportunity to revisit what is this all about. Bryan Ryley,
Thank you.
Could you take us on a little tour of your exhibition, please?
Yes, certainly. The title of the exhibition is Morning Briefing, and the painting to my right is entitled Morning Briefing, and it is basically a trigger for the body of the work. This was done in late 2018, and the notion of a morning briefing was established by my insistence on reading my New York Times morning briefing and being amazed and kind of shocked and stunned by what I would read each morning. And then I would go to the studio and begin work. I work regularly, constantly, my family might say, but at any rate, this particular painting is done, well, years ago. I'll back up a bit and say that I've always been an abstract painter, and one of the things that, with a figurative sensibility in the work, basically the work in abstraction was about the relationship of one form to another, and the pull or attraction of one element to another, or the repulsion of one element to another. I work in a process-oriented way in that I initiate a canvas with a movement on the canvas and then react to that. And it's that interactive process that the work is developed on. Morning briefing, we have an egg shape that's been splattered on the side of a head. This painting is made up of strips of canvas that were strips of the canvas that lays on the floor that receives the overflow from other paintings that I'm working on. And I work with the collage aesthetic, that is the pasting of one element over another to open up a new dialogue for myself and almost a shock, so that the process triggers an idea that I can respond to. So these are strips of canvas on here, and what I've done is attached an ear and a nose to this. We have an eye-like form in here, at least a suggestion of, and then the egg on the face, the shoulders of the figure being presented here. In this dark area, the black area, there's lumps of thicker paint, and basically that came about in looking down at a bucket of paint that was virtually dried, not quite. I decided that it looked like a bunch of crap in this bucket, and that I would put them in the sky around this figure. And it was basically a metaphor for the crap that I thought I was feeling and perceiving in these morning briefings that I was in the habit of reading. So in an interesting way, in the time that we're in right now, in some ways this is kind of a prescient piece for me, in that it established, I was in turmoil and about the condition of things. I was also at a state in my own practice where I wanted to examine cartoons. I've always done that kind of in collage, but the cartoon aspect is really, in many ways, part of our culture, and I wanted to see if I could illustrate things a little bit more. And so I have been pursuing this in the last maybe 2 years. If we go over to this painting, which is called paper bag, it basically feels like and suggests to me the act of putting a paper bag over your head so that that external world is at least muffled. One has at least the semblance of a separation from it. Again, the ground around the figure is very dark and heavy and brooding. The shoulders are barely attenuated. The paper bag itself is a piece of canvas with quite a luscious array of mark making, and it could be in some ways a recognition of sort of Oriental practices of screens and abstraction. From my upbringing, looked at a lot of Oriental work and that flat surface. And the flat surface can have the illusion of depth, but it always comes back to itself as a flat surface. And that's another thing in my practice, this dual reality. What may be an image might only be just an object. It has its own sense of function as a unique and autonomous element. If we move along here, we have 10 works on paper that herald from a couple years prior to these works. And they were early stage works wherein I started to use canvas as a collage element and photographs as well, embedded in the collage. They are all entitled a name, and then in this case, this piece is entitled Blemish, but it's also 16th and Main. And they're all about a corner, 16th, 17th, 11th, 10th Street and Main. And the idea being that we have two individuals having a discussion on the street corner. And again, I'm trying to imply the dialogue of our time and embedding imagery in here in amongst these two figures that suggest what that dialogue might be about. In this particular piece, Blemish, we have an image of a sliced image of Willem de Kooning. De Kooning was a Dutch-American abstract painter who really coined the term the glimpse. That abstraction, he was asked at one time how did he function in making his work? And he said, when I perceive something in just a glimpse, I don't try and articulate it further than just that glimpse, because its reality exists in glimpsing it, and just, it's what now, there's a book out called Blink, and it's about thin slicing. When you perceive something instantly, it probably carries the greatest measure of truth for you than when you try and articulate what that's about. And so it's the instinct to accept that knowledge as it comes to you. And abstraction is based on glimpsing realities as opposed to anchoring them down, which is what representation does. Representation tries to say, this is a singular item, locked, established, and it is just this. Abstraction says, no, it's never just this. It's about many things. And this one's entitled Council, and there's a photograph of a council of people in Mexico City during the Mexican Revolution making decisions about the lives of other people. And it's a warning, really, about authoritarian rule. It's a warning about dictatorship. We can go over to here. This piece is called Masters of War. And I've always been, as common sense people would be, concerned about the influence of an individual or a group of individuals over a mass of individuals. And Masters of War is something that the previous generation to ours, to mine, lived through 2 world wars. We're now in the middle of another war, a different kind of fight that we're involved in. At any rate, these are meant to be images that one is pulled around the major image by things that relate to one another. We know through gestalts that if I point to a circle, you'll see that circle, but you'll also start finding the other circles. If I point to a square, we'll start to find squares. If I point to linear pieces, you'll start to find linear pieces. And the mind will operate that way. And as an artist, as a visual artist, literary people do it differently, musicians do it differently. We use the same tactics, though. We use repetition. We use the idea that if you drive a Volkswagen, you see Volkswagens. It's that gestalt, that recognition of things. Then we use something different. Nowhere in this piece do you find that element. So if I get rid of that element, and then I give it to you, you start to function through it. You start to function through its energy. And it's almost in perception that if we negate or take something away from ourselves, we'll refresh, our minds will refresh, our emotions will refresh, and then when we give it back to ourselves, it instigates that energy again, and we re-look at something. And that's been a major part of my practice. Here we have de Kooning again. And this is called Wit-Biz. Wit-Biz refers to, this actually goes back to the movie, the television series True Detective, which is about, he says, what business are you in? And in a sense, de Kooning was always challenging the viewer as to what business are you in? Why can't you follow this perceptual shift? And a good friend of mine, good friends, we have a little joke about Wit-Biz, so this is dedicated to these folks.
Yeah, Brian, I was going to ask you, could you comment on the choice of your palette and how do they work together? What's the signification?
Sure, absolutely. The palette basically is a black and tan and white. So black, tan, and a cream or a white, with instances of color that happen. Black and tan, this goes back to a visit that my wife and I made to Burma. And on coming back from Burma, my perception of what the Burmese people were living was that they were basically in a mode of being utilitarian objects to a greater power, an autocratic power, a military power. And I came home and I went back to the studio and I thought, now how do I address how I feel? I had some canvas around, old tarpaulins, and I decided that they were utilitarian objects. They were things used for the purpose of somebody else. And they showed the residue of the scarring of the things that the camps had gone through. So I started cutting them and building shapes out of them. The black and the tan in here, I also started to see or use it as a way to suggest what sociologists call the other. People that are other than oneself. Other than probably our Caucasian, Western European background. And so it became a restricted palette to infer that, and a use of material to infer that utilitarian kind of practice. Does that explain things?
Yes, thank you. Can we move on to these large paintings?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This painting is called Colony Man, and it's really a dedication to my father and grandfather, great-grandfather, to my family, really. And it is also a self-portrait, I guess, because of that connection. I see it as the head of a gentleman with maybe standing at a lakeside, these two strips of canvas on the side, perhaps being a tent that is opened up, and we're seeing this gentleman. Inside the gentleman are images that resonate for me up in this area. Almost like a landscape, and it could be a vineyard or an orchard. And when my great-grandparents came to the West Kootenays, they came and planted an orchard. And so it has references for me in it. But it also goes back to why I called it Colony Man. Was dedicated to the idea that people went out from their homelands to other parts of the world. And there was a book written, who wrote 1984?
So obvious.
Here we are, the great historians.
Not very good pop culture.
Yeah.
Orwell.
Orwell was in Burma, and he wrote a book about, did somebody tell us the answer? No.
Yep.
Thank you for that. Orwell was in Burma, and he wrote a book about his experience there. And his, the protagonist of that book, was a gentleman, an English gentleman, sent over to Burma, and he became disillusioned with what the invading group were doing to the citizens of Burma. And so in a sense, what I see here is, if this is the eye of the figure, and this could be the eyebrow, but it is also a dark cloud above a lake. This other shape, which in some ways doesn't make any sense to the head, but it becomes a big face floating in that space. And so these are kind of the turbulent feelings that this person is feeling. And Colony Man is to suggest that a lot of the activity, a lot of the action, a lot of the history that went on was not at all acceptable to everyone. And it had conditional things, obviously, that went with it. it's a recognition of that. And if you look at this in another way, as I mentioned earlier, that there's two ways to look at anything, we can see that what I was calling water could be a figure, and over here it could be another figure. This being the shoulder and body, head up there, head coming down to shoulder here. And they feel like female figures. So this is the space or the land between two figures as well. Shall we move on to this one? This piece is called a fan man. And you might notice in all of these paintings that there's a structure built up of canvas in here and over in here. The nose, everything of this figure is really a collaged element and then paint built up over top of it. So on top of this structure, I've poured a large head in here. And you'll see bits of faces, etc., that are generated by it. And then on top of that, using a large squeegee, I've pulled paint around, creating this large fan-like feeling. And again, this goes back to thoughts about previous generations, about the time we're in now, which is a time of plenty, that the industrial world has allowed for the world to develop its industry, to secure the welfare and health and advance it through time. But it's also created its own problems for us, and those problems of pollution, of servitude, of domination of a single element over a mass. And it's time that we change that. It's time we are now having to evolve into a more egalitarian, equitable distribution of things. So Fan Man is a recognition of the industrial group, the industrial past, and it's kind of an homage to it, and I'm happy that it is behind us rather than so-called with us. This painting is called Worker Man, and it's an homage really to those individuals who are out there working hard for their life, or working hard for our lives. The title comes from my grandson, who was 2 at the time, and he would see the garbage man go by, or the electrician, or the street sweeper, and he would say, "Look, Dampa, there's the worker man." And so I thought, well, let's have a look at Worker Man. You might notice in this painting that there's all kinds of residue, detritus, pardon me, pieces of string, staples, garbage, bits of paint, and all of that's intentionally put in there. They're sweepings from the studio floor, thrown into the paint, and allowed to remain there. And it's kind of a statement about the worker man is out in the world picking up the garbage that the rest of us leave and put around. There's a spirit in the painting of joy and happiness, I think. And it's good because that's what we need to have in our tasks. Again, the canvas on the edges in all 3 of these paintings is to infer an opening, as I mentioned about the tent in Coney Man, but also I see this as curtains opening up onto a stage. So it's to bring that idea of entertainment or how we view the world as something that's a distant narrative from ourselves. But at the same time, I'm trying to, through the physicality of the painting, bring it as an apparent reality in your space, not just an illusion. So it harkens back, I mentioned cartoons earlier, harkens back to that nature of the television, film, and I think painting is like that. It is film, but the film is actually where your mind goes when you're in front of a painting. And we have to, as viewers, allow ourselves the freedom to follow our minds and to not worry about where the mind is going to go. A painting can't hurt you. You can only hurt yourself. And as a painter, I try and examine as much as I can all boundaries. And I'm hoping that the viewer will allow themselves to explore those same things.
I have a question. While I can see that in structure, this painting has elements, verticality and stuff,
Yes.
but its color scheme is very different. What was the motivation for you for this piece?
For this piece? The color scheme was basically to bring up the warmth and dazzle of the summertime daylight. So around this dark center is, again, I see it as reflections on the water and glimpses of images of individuals, of people, 2 women up in this upper left corner. The dark center is seen as perhaps a shadow on the water and reflections within that shadow. It also represents for me a big head, and inside that head are images of, I think, 4 individuals, and they could be individuals that have a reference back to these 2 figures here. And it is about, again, like Calling Man, it is about family. It's about how we reflect on individuals in our lives. The deep darkness of this blue is trying to infer the weight and depth of the kind of brooding or thinking that's going on at this particular time.
Yes. Bryan, can you comment on this one? It's a fairly ominous title suit, and it certainly brings up that feeling and that toxicity of the yellow. What was the inspiration for this painting for you?
Well, it's the inspiration is basically a concern about our climate and climate change, about the earth, and it's called soot, and soot being the particles that come from the combustion of organic product and the oil industry, coal, and the way I read this painting is it's a large head. This little bit of lightness could be, again, the light behind a large head. So we're looking at thoughts, in a sense. This big shape here is like a cloud, smoke. There's elements of that in different places. I see in here, at times, it looks like a chimney. There seems to be a figure standing behind that chimney. Could be a wall. And then when you look at it in another way, it feels like a pendulum, something swinging in there. When you stand back, this looks like a large face. We have a nose, the shadow of the nose, the mouth, the eye up there, almost a Marilyn Monroe kind of image. of her face. It has in here, in this construction, a recognition or a similarity to the image of a cow, which is in a Chagall painting, done just after the Second World War. And it references for me the sense that we've been cutting down forests to feed animals, and perhaps that wasn't the best plan, and maybe we should rethink that. But it also recognizes that the animal world is suffering as well. So it is. This painting really is about the time frame that we're on, and where we have to. It's a painting about the condition I feel, I suppose. Yeah. And this piece over here is the paperwork. It's called Duck, and again it goes back to the painting called Paper Bag, where we've stuck something over somebody's head. We have a duck flying. We have a D, which might be, it almost looks like an I as well. And we have, it looks like something raining on top of this head. And written in this thing are the words all day, every day, and then a footprint. And that footprint, of course, is me in the studio. All day, every day is basically what we all do. Our heads are full of thoughts, responses to what we're doing. And the title Duck is, at times we kind of have to duck. We have to dodge certain things that are going around, which is even more pertinent to the condition we find ourselves in today.
Thank you, Bryan. I was wondering, you've been practicing art for 4 decades plus.
Yes.
What would be the thing that you would want to impart onto all of the aspiring artists that are growing up in this day and age?
Growing up in this day and age. Well, it's probably not any different from any other age in terms of if you wish to pursue life as an artist, what you have to understand is that you can only rely on yourself. And it is your obligation to pursue your truth. And you have to have a lot of courage. You have to have a lot of ability, staying power. You have to be open. You must be open always to what you see around you, open to your thoughts, and spend a lot of time there was to find the artist Agnes Martin. Agnes, your obligation, it's a painting about the condition. I'll ask you a question. She said, meet me in the studio. So get rid of it. And I went, was born in Canada, worked in, and you have to have a lot of courage. You have to have a lot of ability, staying power. You have to be open. You must be open always to what you see around you, open to your thoughts, and spend a lot of time working. You cannot take shortcuts. They don't work in this game. One thing that's very important is our society doesn't give a lot of recognition to emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence is really what's going to help you and save you. If you're a serious artist, you're going to spend a lot of time alone. You're going to spend a lot of time working on things. And you need to know that your journey is a valid journey, even if nobody sees your artwork. That's not the important thing. The important thing is that you get to see your artwork, that you don't waste your time in unnecessary involvements that take you away from the really, truly wonderful journey that you can have if you will focus on it and create a structure that will support you for that. And that's an important thing. One little way to sum this up. In 1978, my wife Margaret and I got in our Volkswagen van and headed off to New Mexico. Our objective there was to find the artist Agnes Martin. Agnes Martin was born in Canada, worked in lumber mills in British Columbia, Alberta, moved to the States, moved to New York City. She wanted to be a practicing artist. In her practice in New York, she rubbed elbows with the world's most influential artists of the time. She left there, moved to New Mexico, and kept herself in an isolated fashion for years. What interested me in wanting to speak with Agnes Martin was that she seemed to be very determined that there was a way for her to function that would be of maximum benefit for her art. So, long story short, we searched and searched and searched for 2 or 3 weeks in the desert, couldn't find her. Snowed one night, heavily, 5 or 6 inches of snow, and we decided, okay, the search is over. So we had been asking, did anybody know where Agnes Martin was? And one fellow said, I think she lives near Galisteo, New Mexico. So on our way, driving north, in this windstorm, snowstorm, there's a small sign that said Galisteo. So we turned on that road and went down into just a little enclave of about 4 buildings. In one little mud hut, there were 2 mud huts, one smaller, one larger, and that seemed to be the only place where somebody was living. Knocked on the door, and a lady called out, "Who is it?" And I told her who I was, and she said, "Are you an artist?" I said, "Yes, I am. I've come to ask you a question." She said, "Meet me in the studio." So Margaret and I went to the studio in a large space, probably as big or bigger than this space we're in right now. There were 3 chairs sitting near a stove. Nothing else in the space other than a shelf with 3 tubes of paint and a blank canvas. We sat down. Agnes Martin came in. She was about this tall, wearing coveralls. And we all sat down, and I asked her if she could give me some advice as I was starting out as a young artist. And she said, "I'll tell you, there are only 3 things that you have to pay attention to. The first of which is that you have to take care of your domestic responsibilities. You have to feed yourself, you have to put a roof over your head, and if you have family, it's your responsibility to care for them." The second objective that she spoke about was that you cannot have any unnecessary involvements. I asked, "Well, what does that mean?" And she said, "Well, if your friends say, 'Do you want to go for a beer?' you have to look at this and think, beer on one hand, opportunity to investigate on the other. Or beer on one hand, I have some responsibilities to my family on the other hand. So you must choose again, you're and filter out what are unnecessary involvements. And the third thing is stay true to the voice you hear. If the voice says, no, you don't want this in front of you, then learn to erase it. Get rid of it. But in the void that the thing you've taken away, you must put something in there. You must, in fact, take action. You can't sit back. So with that advice, that's kind of what I've done in my practice.
There's a question on here from Donna.
Yeah.
It says, what drives your work and where has it taken you on your journey?
What drives my work? I've always been interested in a mark on something. That's basically what drives my work. I can't help but react to things. And I guess I've learned to create a practice whereby I have the time, the energy, and the resources to pursue those marks. And what are those marks? Those marks are actually other entities that are equal to me and anybody else I've ever known. So they're real things. And what drives the practice is really the pleasure in interacting with those things.
Do you have any more questions, Lubos?
No. Bryan, thank you very much. It's very kind of you, and I'm really happy that I got to meet you in my lifetime. And I've seen the imprint you left on many other young artists for your at least 33 decades long teaching position. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And I too have benefited from knowing you.